scientist. Cheers, Amy. Dr. Kulkarni is an interdisciplinary scientist whose work looks at long-term Holocene interactions between humans and the environment. She began her academic journey in India, studying for her undergraduate geology and postgraduate archaeology degrees at Pune University and the Deccan College Postgraduate and Research Institute, respectively. She remained at Pune to take her first lectureship, and in 2016, Dr. Kulkarni gained her PhD at City University, New York, following work with Professor Rebecca Boger. Her work used multi-proxy analyses to assess the relative influence of the environment and human activity to changes in vegetation in the Central Balkans over the last millennium. After working as an adjunct professor and adjunct assistant professor at Hunter College and a quantitative reasoning fellow at City University, New York, she began a paleoecology postdoc at Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, looking at the salt marshes of New England. In 2018, Dr. Kulkarni moved to the UK as a Marie Curie Fellow hosted by the Open University, where she applied her expertise to the Arnest project, which looked at the human impacts of forested regions, the resilience of those areas in the face of future climate change, and how active land management can help mitigate its effects. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Kulkarni. I'll now pass over to you.
Thank you for such a generous introduction. I couldn't believe that was me. Okay, so just confirm whether it's visible. It is? Yes, perfect. And I am audible, right? Okay, great. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. If people are joining from other continents, then good evening, good morning. And thank you so much, Paleoclimate Society, to invite me. And I'm here to talk about some of the learnings from a Marie Curie project, which ran between September 2018 and September 2020. So as I speak, I'm the only one here speaking, but I think the contributions have come from a large group of people. It was an international multidisciplinary consortium, as you could see, starting from Open University, ISEM in France, University of Oxford, University of Southampton. So I do have been standing on the shoulders of the giant. So I would like to thank them first, Walter Finsinger, Pallavi Anand, Santanoge, and Shonil Bhagwat. Pallavi is here today, so I'm waving at her from here. And I should actually acknowledge by, start acknowledging by mentioning the Horizon 2020, the Marie Curie Fellowship grant I got. So it has been the enterprise which was under the umbrella of European Union fellowship programs and Marie Curie. So as I start my talk, I'm here with a disclaimer that I'm almost 36 weeks pregnant, and the perks of pregnancy is occasional breathlessness that I might get, that you might be hearing already. So please bear with me if I just stop for a second and sip some water, and I'll get back to you. So, but in the meantime, I'll try to keep up my breathing and make sure that I'm conveying what I'm conveying. So, as Sophie already mentioned, that I am speaking about my Marie Curie project, Arnest. So that is essentially examining the agroforestry resilience in terms of understanding how socio-ecological systems, their sustainability work. So idea is to gather some kind of case studies from specific regions and trying to understand what they do in terms of tropics, especially wet tropics at large. So Project Arnest specifically worked with two eco-units, as you could see here. One is agroforestry and the second one is sacred forest groves. So agroforestry, as the name suggests, is the mixed use land use system where we are combining two elements basically agro and forestry. So we are basically having the crops planted under the shade of the trees, and most of these trees are mostly native trees used in various different parts of the world. So agroforestry is something like a mixed use system, is a social ecological system, social in terms of agriculture and forestry in terms of ecology as such. So this is one of the social ecological, the mixed use land use system, which had been one of the ecosystems studied in Project Arnest. The second one, which is equally interesting, which is called sacred forest groves. And the word sacred is very interesting over here because these are the community-based or community-led conservation efforts which had been in existence for centuries, if not millennia, in many parts of the world. So sacred forest groves are nothing but cultural means of reforestation or conservation, where trees are conserved in the name of, let's say, ABC God or ABC deity or ABC entity for that matter, through which the conservation has happened, as I said, for centuries or millennia. So these two eco-units, agroforestry and sacred groves, they exist across the tropics in some shape and form. So that makes these systems or interaction with these two systems very interesting and also global or the pan-continental or regional context as such. So looking at these two systems, as I started hunting and as I started brainstorming for my Marie Curie project, I realized that agroforestry system, the social ecological system, since it brings both social and ecological, let's say, benefits, because it benefits agroforest agriculture as well as the forestry or the national forest cover. As such, India came up with something called as the National Agroforestry Policy, where idea is to increase the land under the agroforestry, meaning planting more and more crops under the trees, native shade trees possibly. So what it will entail basically is increase in agricultural yield, at the same time increase in national cover. And this is something which is very interesting in terms of climate change mitigation as well, because we are in tropics, more trees we have, more carbon we are sequestering. So it also had a really nice global goods kind of implications, positive implications from which other tropical countries could learn from. So I found it very interesting. And what I found it, since it is an agroforestry policy, the much of the deal or much of the implementation is going to fall on these two key units or key actors as such. One is agriculturalists, farmers, and second is the Indian Forest Services, the foresters. So as I started looking into the actual land management strategies by these two and looking at the mindsets by these two, what I found out is agriculturalists or farmers for centuries or millennia, for generations and generations, they have been using fire as one of the land management strategies. These are controlled fires, which are specifically implemented during pre-monsoon season. The monsoon is a very set pattern. We'll talk about it in a second. But during the pre-monsoon season, they definitely like to burn. It doesn't have to be slash and burn through cutting and whatnot, but some kind of burning they would like to introduce in the landscape, which they think is helpful for their crops to get better and get better yields. On the other hand, the Indian Forest Services, the foresters themselves, they have a big no-no for fire. So they will do everything. They will go to great lengths just to cut down any instinct of fire in the landscape. So I found this entire conundrum very interesting, that this is an important policy from ecological perspective, from the social perspective, from environmental perspective, climatic perspective, but these two key actors, they do have two very conflicting kind of strategies. So how it will basically implicate on the impacts of this positively constructed policy. So with that, I just realized that I would love to study fires anyway. So what I should do is I will go ahead and find out a model system which could be representative of tropical social ecological system. So I found it in the Western Ghats of India, and those who are not that much acquainted with tropical ecology, as such, I would take you to India, and this is the western part of India, as you could see. So Western Ghats are nothing but, this is a tall mountainous range which goes parallel on the west coast of India. And it is practically all the way from the central part of India, all the way going to the southern tip of India. It's a really long one. And it basically is one of the rainiest, if not the rainiest, one of the rainiest regions in the world. One could get literally 3,000 or 4,000 millimeter rain in here, and the rains are basically coming, as I said, it is an Indian summer monsoon system. So it rains basically during June to September. Much of it is 80% of the annual, and the rest of it 20%. So this is one of the rainiest region in the world. And as a result, what we are looking at as a Western Ghats, somewhere here, is one of the 25 or many more we have now biodiversity hotspots. And it's not just any biodiversity hotspot with thousands of endemic species. This hotspot basically support highest population density in the world. So it is once again a very interesting system very geological feature which had been in existence since early Eocene, if I'm not mistaken. And then that system has been habitated by people for millennia, since Pleistocene for sure. And then that system has been getting transformed by humans for millennia, and more so during the Holocene. And that system has been in existence for a while. So it could be something as an age-old or ancient kind of social ecological system. And the system is still in existence. That system is still supporting. It has really spectacular landscape. And that system is supporting people through very many means. And agroforestry, once again, really beautiful lush green landscapes are supporting highest population density in the world through agroforestry, one of the means, and also it coexists with the sacred groves. So once again, this is one of the model systems among many actually, and I picked this one for Project Arnest to study long-term resilience of long-term resilience of these agroforestry system or ancient social-ecological system. So as a bigger problem, has a bigger research objective, as you could see. The idea was to study long-term transformations of this agroforestry system with specific or with respect to fires and monsoon as such, and trying to see how forest grows, how they do in terms of in the long-term context as cultural drivers of reforestation or conservation. And it had been like really interesting to see that what are the interplays between these two eco-units and their implications in terms of sustaining biodiversity in this biodiversity hotspot. So once again, let me reorient you a little bit. We are here, like the samples are coming from the central part of the Western Ghats. Western Ghats once again goes north-south like that. So this is the central part of the Western Ghats, and there are multiple agroforestry systems and multiple sacred groves which could be found very much in the vicinity of each other. So it doesn't have to be, you could see the scale here. And some of them are pretty close. So you could see this particular agroforestry system is just next to one of the sacred groves. And as such, so they keep influencing each other. And idea was to look at these influences. So, and then to tie them in terms of what could be the actual possible policy implication or pragmatic policy implications, which could be actually tangible for policymakers to look at one day and see that, oh, this kind of science which we could use and incorporate in our policies. So today specifically, I'll be talking about this particular agroforestry system, which as you could see, as I said, in vicinity of other agroforestry as well as sacred grove system. So moving on, a little bit about the approaches, the methodology. So I don't think this audience needs really extensive explanation about what are these different proxies which are under study. But let me go through them. So idea is once again to see forested landscape, wet evergreen lush forest, and in their interaction with humans and climate as such. So in terms of the forest, the vegetational variables essentially came from the fossil pollen data. So sedimentary cores, we take out very many, it could be forearms, it could be this and that. So in this case, since it is the vegetation or the forest, we are looking at the transformation. It is a fossil pollen data. Fossil pollen data can give us so many more entities to look at. The basic or key of them is the compositional changes, extent of the forest that in general, the plant diversity if the rarefied pollen tags are used that way, and also the degree of transformation, or we also call it the temporal beta diversity, the beta diversity across the time. In terms of humans, what are the key proxies? The proxies are essentially the microscopic charcoal data and macroscopic charcoal data, which can give us anthropogenic fire regimes. And the word anthropogenic is very important in here because, as I said, we are dealing with wet evergreen forests where it rains, rains, and rains. So the soil moisture stays throughout the year. And the fires which exist in the landscape are truly anthropogenic fire. Unless a fire is lit, there is not going to be any fire. And that's the key characteristic of rainforest in general across the world. So how it is changing, that is one of the things which are also part of this study in a way. And when we talk about humans and fires, anthropogenic fires, it also has very apparent connections with the land use history. There is also an archaeological component which will be at play throughout the study, and we had it in mind. So we also have incorporated that. And the third aspect of the past for the future approach is climatic variables. So trying to see how we can delineate or basically demarcate what could be the key variability aspects of the Indian summer monsoon. And more so is what are the periods of enhanced aridity, especially since the 4.1 KY event, which has put Indian subcontinent into sort of dryness path, So these are the three particular key aspects of this, and we can take them together, and what we could do out of it is something like this. So once again, let me orient you right here, central Western Ghats, this particular agroforestry setting we are looking at. And what we are looking at is almost 4,000 years of record from this particular sediment core or particular locality. And what do we have here? These blue curves are essentially the model data, and this is delta O18 record for the ISM intensity. So we are looking at the Indian summer monsoon. Higher we go, we are going towards the wetter horizons versus, like in this direction, if we go, lower we go, we are talking about more dry periods. Looking at these black and gray curves here, these are macro and micro charcoal records respectively. They are basically indicating how anthropogenic fires were. Once again, higher we go, higher fires, lower we go, less or no fires, as you could see in here. And looking at these three, which basically came from the forest perspective or vegetational perspective, is essentially, as I said, the temporal beta diversity, the beta diversity aspect, which has gone across the time. That is one of the things which one can get from the pollen data. And these are the two which are the key aspects we would be looking at. One is the actual canopy cover, which is basically delineated from the arboreal pollen data, and the plant diversity, which is depicted in the form of the floristic richness or pollen richness, which is once again have gone through five, six different statistical variables or statistical steps as such. So starting from the very key aspect, the climatic aspects, if we go ahead, we can easily see that there are three aridity sequences. If we try to synchronize both modeling and proxy data, we can see that there are three aridity sequences, which I tried to highlight through and through this diagram. So why aridity is so important? Because the thing is, as you could see over here, that agroforest and the sacred groves, and each of this is very greenish part, is essentially it also has so many protected areas by the government. So the idea is not to have fires within those protected areas, otherwise you are under a lot of trouble. Is essentially because, as once again, it goes back to the very conflicting kind of strategies towards managing landscape. So higher the aridity or more the aridity or aridity in connection with fires, it basically runs us towards the higher risk of fire spreading into forest and beyond agricultural areas. So when it comes to fires, there are two distinct fire periods, as you could see during the last 4,000 years. So one is between 1800 and 1400 right here. And the second one is basically starting around 400 and going all the way up to present as such. And as you could see that starting from the 4,000 years, which is sort of a starting point for this particular study, you could see that the fires had been non-existent sort of in this system. And because of that, it is very interesting that these fires start suddenly appearing. They pick up and then eventually they die down before getting on again, but not to that particular degree. So these points, basically 1800, 1400, and eventually 400 years before present, as such, this could be considered as a point of systemic transformation because system hasn't seen this before. And this is a new thing or new paradigm as such, which was introduced in the system. So it's very interesting looking at that. One more component, as I said, is the human component, which we should look into. The thing is, over the 4,000 years, we have been through a lot. This system has been through a lot, all the way going from the Neolithic ages to the British era, the colonial era. as such. And what essentially we can see is the land use has changed a lot, all the way going from the localized farming or nomadic pastoralism, eventually getting into cultivation, extensive cultivation of the paddy fields or rice cultivation. There are certain aspects of the arboriculture, meaning forest-based production as such, and eventually urban growths, the first few, and eventually the agroforestry system, which was set for this particular region, also the sacred gurus which existed in. So in general, if we see the transformation over the 4,000 years, what we are looking at is the localized, a very localized land use going into regional land use and extensive land use as such. So idea is basically to compare various different scenarios to each of these time slices in general, and then basically see what we could learn from it. So as we go ahead, there is one thing I think which I think all of us would have identified or observed anyway, is it looks like as if I have forged these two curves as such, canopy cover and the plant diversity. And I swear I didn't forge them, because something apparent is happening here, something very interesting is happening here. And as you could see, there is a strong correlation between the canopy cover and the plant diversity. So it is very interesting. It is a tropical system. So more the trees in the landscape, higher could be, or lower the trees in the landscape, or lower the woodland in the landscape, if we want to see, lower would be the plant diversity. So this is a very interesting kind of revelation, if we want to call it, especially from the tropical system. If we try to compare and study the tropical systems, we will realize that this is a very typical of tropical systems. Going back to fires and monsoon and the synchronicity or synergistic effects of aridity and fires, what we could see is especially during this part, because enhanced aridity, zero, nothing, no fires, nothing, but these two distinct time periods, as we could see, we realized that there are certain percussions on the canopy cover or the woodland in general. We could see that it basically picks up eventually the fires. As they start, they do not immediately impact on woodland directly. So there is no one-to-one kind of correlation. It's not like, although these are sort of switches that there was no fire, then fire, and no fire and fire throughout the 4,000 years, but that doesn't give us a one-to-one correlation that as soon as the fires are started, we would see some kind of dipping down in the canopy cover or the woodland. So as fire eventually build, in general, that is where we can see that the canopy cover or the woodland starts declining a little bit, eventually picking up again as the fires die down. So this is something which is very interesting in terms of science, and how it translates to policy. We'll see that as we go ahead. But there are two important takeaways from this particular analysis, this particular diagram, as we could see, is the use of fires is often equated with the loss of woodland. It's just immediate, it's a disturbance, and it would happen like right away, but that's not true. So use of fires does not equate to loss of woodland. It basically depends on the system, how system is going to cope up with it. So if you could see that as fires eventually died down, there were occasions where there was intensified arboriculture or forest-based production, where without fires, we have been seen a lot of, extensive increase in the canopy cover or the woodland as such. And if somebody wants to argue that, oh, there were no fires initially as well, so that is easy, that could happen. But once again, we have added many more people in the landscape. The land use has gone like more and more regional. And one thing that is, which we have to observe is during this period when there were no fires, before the first fires appear in this landscape, the actual woodland cover was much lower than what we had over here. So once again, adding more people doesn't always mean that we are going to have lower canopy cover or lower woodland. These could be the efforts of the people, as we could see over here, because people switched in this particular system towards the forest-based production. So they valued forest, and maybe they have intentionally increased the forest cover because their livelihoods were dependent on it. So this is, once again, the context is very important. It's just not, there isn't a one-to-one correlation between the canopy cover or woodland, for that matter, with respect to fires. Fire can be considered as a disturbance, but once again, how much it is going to sort of disturb the landscape. That depends on the landscape. So context, the cultural context is equally important. The second thing I think we should observe here is the present day plant diversity, which is somewhere around here. Even if it plus minus and errors and this and that, we could see that that is not outside the historic variability. So if we could see and if we could put it in the context, we can see that the starting point is somewhere here. Eventually going up and down, there are certain kings as such. And eventually what we could see, the plant diversity, notwithstanding all the changes that have happened for this 4,000 years, the present day plant diversity in the Western Ghats is, it is recoverable because we have seen some examples in the past as such. Moving on, if we could just want to tie, especially the fires, because aridity is going to act on it. Aridity is going to just exacerbate whatever situation it is. But if we want to try the connections, or if we want to identify the connections between the fires and the plant diversity, what we realize is there are multiple fancy ways we can put it together. As one of the fancy ways here is basically to put them across each other. Once again, this is charcoal pieces, microscopic charcoal. And this is nothing but the plant richness values or pollen richness values, plant diversity values. So if we just put it together, we realize that once again, this is the interval that is where fire started. And we could see that immediately we do not see decline actually, or any dip as such in the plant diversity. So this is the starting point, the 4,000 years, and this is today. So if we try to see that, the present day diversity is slightly higher than that of where we started. So once again, that is not true for each and every case, but in most cases except this one. So these are the all taxa, or total plant diversity within this landscape, versus this is exclusively the woody taxa or the woodland taxa, or tree and shrub taxa combined together, if you want to call it in much simpler terms. So if they are put against the fires, what we can see is this really fantastic correlation, telling us what could be the dynamics within the system. Another fancy way I would say to do or to identify the connections, identify the dynamics, is to do cross correlation. So if we want to put the fire data against the plant diversity data, fire data against wood taxa diversity, canopy cover, blah, blah, blah. So there are so many different ways we can identify the connections, and many cases they could fit together. So for example, as I said, the canopy cover and plant diversity, just as an example I would give quickly, is there was a strong correlation between plant diversity and canopy cover. So once again, this particular graph with the cross correlation, it shows that there is zero lag, and the highest or tallest kind of correlation we could see here, or the bar we could see here, it basically shows that zero meaning there is no lag. There is basically a very strong correlation without any lag as such between these two. So canopy cover increases, it has direct implications, immediate implications on plant diversity increasing along with it. And why? Once again, we could see that in a few seconds. Same thing with the fire and plant diversity. So in the earlier diagram, if I could switch, there was no direct correlation, which we also saw in the earlier slide. And on this slide, we could also see that there are loose correlations as such. And so that way we could see that. So immediate effects of the fire on plant diversity are non-existent, but it eventually picks up. There is a lag of roughly 250 years or something. And as if the fires continue in the landscape, then it starts basically impacting the diversity as such. So once again, this is very important in terms of understanding the systemic dynamics. So I'm switching back to the much simpler diagram where we do have the scatter plots and we do have the regression values. So what it tells us in terms of like science part of it is plant diversity is weakly correlated with fires if we want to look at. And what we basically learned is there is a lag between the fire and ecology, or fire and fire diversity. So what basically is harmful for the system is the sustained burning. And then when that sustained burning is coupled with enhanced aridity, it does reduce, or it does impact badly on plant diversity. And the mechanism is essentially opening the canopies. So as close as canopy closing and canopy which are smaller, Of course, they will have implications for the plant diversity, but when the canopy openings are much, much higher and the canopies are not connected to one another, that is what we mean by increased canopy openings, that is where it basically harms the system. So what we are looking at is connectedness within the system, which can basically foster ways for sustaining the biodiversity. The plant diversity, once again, animal diversity will come along with it, which is sort of a resultant form of diversity. So what it means when we say the plant diversity is not directly getting affected by fires or weakly correlated with fires, there is a lag as such as we could see over here. That basically gives us some perspective on the agricultural fires, slash and burn to an extent, and in general, low intensity fires on the agricultural land, that they are low intensity, they are short term, they are not going to be the long term ones. It is not a sustained burning as such. So it could be sort of based on this science, what it means for the policy or actual ecological management is these low intensity agricultural fires, although agricultural land could be next to the protected areas, this could be a middle ground, accommodating both traditional practices and avoidance of fires on the forest, because that had been the basic conflict. And don't ignite fire because your agricultural land is next to protected areas. What if it just escalates and goes into protected areas? Then we won't be having any kind of conservation and whatnot. So that had been the sort of mindset existing, and that had been the conflict. There are multiple reasons for this conflict. And as we go ahead, we can look into them. But this could be sort of a middle ground, which is also evidence-based, because science can tell us that this is how policy could be made better in a way where we can find the ways we can work together. Moving on in terms of sustaining the diversity, and once again, I'll take a moment to orient you a little bit. We are here like 4,000 years timeline. Once again, what we have here is the pollen richness, and there is another entity. I might go into it during Q&A if people like that. So this is the total plant richness, all terrestrial taxa versus these are the woody taxa which form the canopies. So the richnesses for each of these are basically depicted over the time here. And what we can see is these are the fire periods. So these red arrows right here. So no fire, fire, no fire, fire right here. And then we can also see some of these interesting climatic periods or intervals, to be precise, which could have influence from the climatic perspective, the aridity perspective. So once again, diversity across the time, there is one thing which directly strikes our eye is total plant diversity is changing. There are certain ups and downs, kinks and whatnot. But if you look at the canopy forming woody taxa, except one part right here, there is little to no difference throughout the last 4,000 years. So once again, it is very interesting that maybe the canopy cover reduced, but not the diversity as such. Diversity remains sort of intact, especially for the woody taxa. And what changed? So what's the component? Because the woody taxa, as I said, it is both trees and shrubs as such. And then if we talk about adding grasslands, so grass pollen or herbaceous taxa and whatnot, they constitute the total terrestrial taxa. So if not woody taxa, so what is it that is contributing to the diversity? So if we compare, especially this particular record, and I don't mean to read too much into it, but one possibility, as we could see over here, looking at the plant diversity in general, what contributes to the diversity of the Western Ghats at the moment is the actual forest-dwelling herbaceous taxa and not the woody taxa themselves. So woody taxa had been in the landscape for a while, and they did not reduce that much in the diversity as it seems from this particular record. Once again, and what basically is contributing to the diversity is the forest dwelling, and forest dwelling meaning the herbaceous taxa are understory. They grow under the canopies. So once again, that ties us back to having lesser canopy openings, so that way the diversity get fostered as such. So forest dwelling herbaceous taxa are the one who are basically responsible for the diversity of Western Ghats, which could be controversial. We can talk about it. The second thing is very important here. When it comes to the tree taxa, there are certain trees which are so-called habitat specialist trees or native trees, if we want to call it, which had been in existence for a while. So this is a classic typical pollen diagram. I don't know how many people are acquainted with it, but once again, last 4,000 years right here, this record actually goes back much further, 8,000 years. So I just tried to plot it and see that how these different trees, habitat specialist trees, meaning trees which will make Western Ghats, as such endemic trees. So if we try to see that all the way from the 8,000 years in this record, either they exist throughout the record or they basically come and go, but they have been in existence for a while. So these are sort of old growth trees or native trees, which has shown resilience towards varying degrees of land use and management. So this is very interesting because these are the same trees, the habitat specialist trees as they are named here, or native trees. They are basically the trees which are used in the agroforestry system to basically give the shade for any crops which are planted underneath. So what it means, what science means in terms of policy here is patches of these native trees which already exist in this agroforestry landscape could be the natural places to focus on organized conservation and restoration. And why do we need that? Once again, as I said, that higher the canopy cover, higher the diversity as such. And in this very human-dominated social ecological system or human-dominated landscapes in simple terms, what we lack is basically the landscape connectivity. So we do have patches of trees or protected areas, patches of woodland, and what we need is more and more connection within them so higher diversity could get fostered as such. So in this case, as I said, the herbaceous taxa could travel from one canopy to another as such. So these could be the natural places. The agroforestry landscape, they already have tree cover. So why don't we use these systems as such to connect and get connectedness within the landscape, and which could help us foster the diversity. So what are the basic insights or what are the takeaways from this particular study is in the Western Ghats, as we could see, the fire-plant relationship is, the plant diversity relationship is uneven across time. So there were different ways people managed the landscape, and that has affected the fire and plant diversity relationship. So there is no one-to-one correlation, there is no on-off switch as such. So the fires would affect the canopy cover and canopy cover would affect the plant diversity. Yes, there is a direct connection between the canopy cover, a strong correlation between the canopy cover and plant diversity. So fires, if they are sustained, if they affect the canopy cover, we would get implications, bad implications in terms of plant diversity. And the strong correlation, second point is to emphasize or to understand is the trees are, these are the key determinant or critical determinant of the diversity of in this landscape, especially a tropical landscape or any tropical landscape for that matter. Because the crucial role of maintenance of trees is the way we can foster biodiversity in the landscape. So once again, nothing new over there or no revelation as such, unless people have been working in the grassland landscape or temperate deciduous kind of landscape where the grasslands basically foster higher the grassland or higher the open land would foster the higher diversity as such, but not in this. This is a typical makeup of tropical landscape, especially tropical rainforest. If you want to specify as such in terms of the ecosystem, that maintenance of trees is the key way to foster or sustain diversity. Lastly, what we learned is effective fire and ecological management in the Western Ghats or wet tropics at large, if you want to call it. It requires a long-term perspective because these systems have been in use or have been getting influence for centuries, if not millennia. So unless we understand what has been happening and what was the baggage for these systems, it's very difficult to manage these systems, and then there is always a risk of getting into these wrong paradigms, getting into this wrong sort of biological baselines, that's what we call it, and just start restoring something which never existed. So what basically is needed in terms of ecological management or looking into ecological management is a long-term perspective. And what else it demands is an inclusive and integrated approach. And what do I mean by inclusive and integrated approach is like, it's very important to look at the bigger picture. The bigger picture is people or anthropogenic, once again, word already has a very negative kind of connotation. But it is very important to understand that people are part of the landscape. People have been living there. People are always looked at as a force which will always be a destructive one. So yes, they do burn the landscape, of course, but they also plant trees at the same time. And planting trees could be contributing towards the conservation beyond protected areas, especially through the landscape connectivity, which is very important. And this is one of the very important ways to foster diversity in the landscape, such as I said, human-dominated landscape. The conservation needs to go beyond the protected areas. So the policies, whatever it may be, doesn't have to be the national agroforestry policy specifically, but if they are evidence-based, that is one thing. And second thing is, if they are informed of historic and cultural regimes, they have a potential to work for both biodiversity and people, especially in case of agroforestry system. As I said, it is a very much relevant or very much appropriate in terms of the social ecological benefits. We could see that they have a potential to work for both biodiversity and people, provided these two entities come to terms, come to a middle ground and say, okay, we could do this versus that. So that way it could be accommodative of both or various aspects of the landscape management. That's the way to go. So in order to do that, I think I just like to put these two slides because these cartoons are amazing. And I really encourage everybody to go to this publication, which is actually a completely pictorial kind of publication, which gives us the bigger picture. So in order to address all these issues at once, what we need is we need an ecosystem approach. We need an approach which is interdisciplinary, which engages different stakeholders, which brings people together from various different expertise. And that expertise could be anything. And then we have to be talking to each other, and we have to be getting a common language, which we do not necessarily have in general, and engage people in a way we can get to better things. So I think what it entails is a newer mixture of expert. I really like that. Each of us has to wear like different hats. It just doesn't, I just do not have to be sort of like environmental scientist or paleoecologist or whatnot. I have to be all of them together. I have to be connecting with people, talking with people, and brainstorming about how to bring things together. It will have decision makers, it will have some aspects of politics, some aspects of social sciences, natural sciences. They have to be blended together. As I said, we have to come up with a common language to speak with each other, that what we are looking at, if this is the system we are looking at, how we are looking at that system, what are different perspectives. So that is something which will help us to make a decision, because every ecosystem is different and every ecosystem needs an approach which is unique to it. So that's why in order to make that ecosystem decision, it is very important to be able to get on the same table, to be able to talk and to be able to listen to each other, which is very, very, very important. So with that, I would like to thank everybody for listening. And there are multiple ways we can stay in touch. I'm active on Twitter, and so is the project Arnest, which is sort of now a legacy account because the project has sunsetted in September. And I would like to take this occasion once again to introduce something which is very relevant to this topic. So everybody, of course, knows about past global changes, the PAGES. So PAGES has come up with a new working group in late 2019. So it is still pretty much new. Much is not happening with the COVID, everybody knows, and this is called as DiverseK network, which focuses on integrating diverse knowledge systems for inclusive environmental policies. So it is a network of environmental and social scientists. They are working together to develop recommendations for the pressing issues, environmental and social justice issues across the world. It is a very localized ecosystem-based approach. So I would invite everybody to join the newsletter if they like, or if you are active on Twitter. We are also active on Twitter, and as I said, I'm one of the committee members, one of the steering committee members, co-steering the activity for DiverseK. So I would love to answer any questions you may have on that as well. Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you,